Information Policy, Census, and National Archives Subcommittee will come to order. And let me welcome you to today's hearing entitled Census 2010, Assessing the Bureau's Strategy for Reducing the Undercount of Hard-to-Count Populations. This hearing is a follow-up to the Subcommittee's July 2008 hearing on the 2010 Census Integrated Communications Campaign. We have with us today invited distinguished colleagues who have asked to participate in this hearing, and they will be here shortly. And I will ask unanimous consent that they be allowed to participate. Thank you. And without objection, the chair and ranking minority member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. Without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. And I will begin with an opening statement. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the Census Bureau's strategies for 2 aspects of the Integrated Communications Campaign. 1, the partnership program and paid advertising. We seek answers to the questions of 1, how will the communications plan decrease the undercount and increase the mail response rate of hard-to-count communities? And 2, whether the campaign messaging will generate community support for the census. We will also look at funding for the 2010 census, including the $1 billion allocated in the stimulus bill. Census Day 2010 is nearly 1 year away. Yet, as we learned in our hearing on March 5th, there is still much work to be done by the Bureau to put its operation plans in place. The Regional Partnership Program could be very helpful in ensuring that everyone is counted. The program is credited with attributing to the success of the 2000 census. According to a report of the GAO, key census-taking activities such as recruiting temporary census workers and encouraging people to complete their questionnaire would have been less successful had it not been for the Bureau's aggressive partnership efforts. The paid advertising program could also play a key role in reducing the undercount, as it did in 2000. The Bureau has plans to use national and local media to get the word out about the census and encourage participation. Media buys should seek to reach diverse markets in the most effective and cost-efficient manner possible. We will find out today how the Bureau plans to accomplish this goal. I thank all of our witnesses for appearing today and look forward to their testimonies. And I want to thank Ms. Watson for joining us today. And I want to go to my friend and the ranking minority member, Mr. McHenry of North Carolina. I know you just got here.
I'm a little winded, yes.
I can imagine. Take your time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for testifying today. Chairman Clay and I certainly have the same goal, which is to make sure that this is the best census in our nation's history, the most accurate census in our nation's history. And an important function of that would be to reduce the undercount for this census. And the Census Bureau's regional partnership program and advertising plan are part of an integral communications campaign aimed at reducing the 2010 undercount, reaching hard-to-count communities, and achieving a full count decennial census. Reaching these communities is not only important but also required by the United States Constitution. A full count census and actual enumeration is specifically and firmly rooted in Article 1 of our Constitution. The economic stimulus bill included $1 billion in additional funding for the Census Bureau, with at least $250 million of that amount specifically designated by Congress for the Partnership Program and outreach to traditionally hard-to-count communities. The Partnership Program for the 2000 census involved more than 140,000 organizations, and for 2010, the Bureau has already partnered with over 10,000 organizations and hired over 800 partnership staff. In order for such a large endeavor to succeed, rigorous oversight and transparency of funds and of participants is vitally important. In hiring temporary enumerators, the Census Bureau has testified that it will conduct thorough FBI background checks that include fingerprinting. I think that's good reassurance for the public that when an enumerator comes to visit them, that they can open the door and it's a law-abiding citizen on the other side. We must make sure that the Bureau has comparable measures in place to hold organizations participating in the partnership program and their employees equally accountable for their actions. Furthermore, the Bureau should have clear guidelines and standards for the selection of partner organizations. It's important to ensure that contractors are awarded through a competitive process and not simply money doled out to anyone who applies, as well as monitor how and where money is spent by participating organizations. Accountability in the spending of these funds is obviously essential. Today's hearing presents an opportunity for the Bureau to describe the quality control measures in place to fully implement this plan, and in their hiring of all field workers and enumerators and the field work process in general. As I've stated before, Chairman Clay and I share the goal of ensuring that every individual in America will be counted once, only once, and where they live on Census Day 2010. A transparent, accountable partnership program and a strong advertising campaign are fundamental to achieving it. I also recognize that the list of folks testifying today is not as full and complete as we had hoped. In terms of our request that the head of the partnership program testify about the roles that they're fulfilling, we'd hoped to hear directly from the individual that's overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of our taxpayer dollars, and that we believe is essential to making sure that we reduce the undercount and reach hard-to-reach communities. I think it's unfortunate that we don't have the division head testifying today, and I think we'll have many specific questions that Mr. Metzenberg that we'll need to get specific answers from, and the reason why we wanted the division head to testify is so that we can get those specific questions. We certainly respect you. We certainly respect the duties you fulfill, but we also want to make sure that we get specific answers so that we can have the proper policies in place and the funding in place to reduce this undercount. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McHenry. I'll now go to Ms. Watson, if you have an opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I think holding today's hearing is very, very important as we examine the Census Bureau strategy for reducing the undercount of traditionally hard-to-count populations in the 2010 census. I look forward to hearing about the challenges and the goals shaping the Bureau's integrated communications campaign to promote the census, improve participation, and decrease the differential undercount. Since the establishment of the decennial census in 1790, every census has experienced an undercount, and particularly in my district, certain areas run double-digit undercount. According to the Government Accountability Office, the 2000 census missed an estimated 2% of the U.S. population, a disproportionate number of which were minorities, lower-income households, and children. My district in particular has traditionally been undercounted due to a lack of engagement with local constituencies. This undercount is troubling because without accurate population data, it's important to ensure that the Americans have proper representation in state and federal government, and that federal grants are targeted to where they are needed the most. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 authorized $501.5 billion worth of new spending measures to revitalize the American economy while assisting those most impacted by the recession. This unprecedented investment in our future makes the need for the 2010 census to be as thorough and accurate as possible even greater, as the success of the stimulus relies upon complete population data to ensure funds are directed efficiently and equitably. The Census Bureau's Integrated Communications Campaign reduced the undercount rate for the 2000 census relative to 1990, and according to the GAO, appears to be a comprehensive and to be integrated. Success now depends on the ability of the Bureau to move effectively from the planning to the operational phase while incorporating best practices and lessons learned from the 2000 census to translate increased public awareness into actual participation. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank all of the panelists who've come here today for their cooperation with today's proceedings, and I look forward to hearing more details about the partnership program and the target media strategy of the Integrated Communications Campaign as we monitor efforts to reduce the undercount in the 2010 census. Thank you so much, and I yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Watson, for that opening statement. Now I want to go to Mr. Chaffetz of Utah. You recognized for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you calling this hearing. It's important with the discharge of the constitutional duty in conducting the census that we all be vigilant in the expenditure of dollars and the time and effort and the call upon the American people to participate willingly in helping us to make sure that we do not undercount the population of the United States of America, nor do we overcount it. So I appreciate the witnesses who are willing to come here today and participate in this hearing. I thank them. I also want to make sure, as we move forward and we discuss the issues that affect the census, that we also deal with the American people's money in a transparent and accountable way. There are significant dollars that will be flowing out the door, and I want to make sure that we have safeguards in place to monitor the expenditure of those dollars, and that the American people have the ability to understand where and how those dollars are spent. I also have some questions and concerns about how and who we would partner in order to execute this, so that we have the faith of the American people that it's being done in a transparent way, that they have the safety and security that knowing that their vital information is dealt with appropriately. And I do have some questions that I appreciate you addressing regarding the partnership program specifically. Again, I thank you for being here today, and thank the chairman for calling this hearing. Thank you. Yield back my time.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your statement. Let me now introduce our panel. We will hear from first from Mr. Thomas Messenborg, Acting Director of the United States Census Bureau, and thank you for being here. Our next witness will be Mr. Robert Goldenkoff, Director of Strategic Issues at the GAO. Mr. Goldenkoff's responsibilities include directing work on the 2010 census. Good to see you again. And our third witness will be Mr. Jeff Tarkasian, Executive Vice President of Draft FCB, the prime contractor of on the 2010 Census Integrated Communications Campaign. So good to see you again, Jeff. And our final witness will be Ms. Stacy Cumberbatch, the City Census Coordinator for the City of New York. Ms. Cumberbatch is responsible for managing the execution of census operations in the city. Let me welcome you, Ms. Cumberbatch, and all of you to our hearing today. It is the policy of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee to swear in all witnesses before they testify. Would all of you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do. And thank you. Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Each of you will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Your complete written testimony will be included in the hearing record. The yellow light will indicate that it is time to sum up. The red light will indicate that your time has expired. Mr. Messenborg, you may begin with your opening statement.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to provide you with an update on the Census Bureau's 2010 Integrated Communications Program. Our 2010 goal is to count everyone, no matter how difficult or challenging that task may be. An insightful, engaging, and effective communications campaign is an essential component of a successful census. The 2010 Communications Program is multifaceted, employing and integrating paid advertising, public relations, a very robust partnership program, and a census and schools component. The campaign uses multimedia to reach people by television, radio, magazine, newspapers, outdoor and commuter media, and the internet, and through trusted voices in the local communities. The 2010 Communications Campaign is data-driven, using detailed track level on mailback response rates from Census 2000 and updated household characteristics to identify the hard-to-count segments of our population within media markets and local communities. This information will help provide the right message in the right media in the appropriate language at the right time. The hard-to-count track-level information was used to segment the population into 8 relatively homogeneous groups or clusters. 5 of the clusters represent hard-to-count populations, and they will be targeted during every phase of the communication campaign. Decisions related to budget allocations and media buys use the hard-to-count scores. The advertising campaign includes a national and a local component. With the addition of $100 million in stimulus funding for advertising, our preliminary estimate allocates $63 million for the national campaign. The national campaign is designed to reach all persons who consume media in English, regardless of race or ethnicity. $82 million will be spent on local advertising, and that is directed at the harder-to-count populations. The local targeted advertising delivers messages in local, ethnic media, in language, and in culture. The Census in Schools program will be national in scope with an emphasis on hard-to-count populations. This program encourages students to tell their parents about the importance of the census. The program provides every school with teaching guides, lesson plans, maps, brochures, and take-home materials in English and in Spanish. Now, while paid advertising can educate, inform, and motivate households and individuals, Census 2000 demonstrated that Census Bureau partners at the national and local levels serve as powerful and trusted advocates that can effectively reach segments of the population not persuaded by advertising. Partnerships will be integrated with all other communication channels, including advertising, broadcast and print media, internet initiatives, and the Census in Schools program, with the aim of creating positive messages about the 2010 census in hard-to-count communities. Staff in the Census Bureau's 12 regional census centers began work with key stakeholders in mid-2008 when 120 partnership staff were mobilized to engage local and state governments, tribal leaders, faith-based and community-based organizations to support the census through the establishment of complete count committees an effective and proven initiative. We now have 680 local partnership specialists hard at work recruiting trusted local leaders who will use their influence and networks to motivate their communities to fully participate in the 2010 census. Currently, more than 13,000 organizations have made commitments to partner with the U.S. Census Bureau. Stimulus funding will permit us to add an additional 2,000 partnership staff. Partnership staff, like all of our field staff, will be hired locally. They know the neighborhood, the challenges, and the trusted voices in the community. Mobilizing a larger and better trained cadre of partnership staff and partners will help us meet the challenges of counting an increasingly diverse population. Mr. Chairman, our integrated communication campaign is well positioned to educate, inform, motivate, and mobilize our nation's households to participate in the 2010 census. A complete and accurate 2010 census is our highest priority, and we are determined to produce a census count that fairly represents everyone in our nation. Thank you.
Mr. Messenborg, and we'll go to Mr. Goldenkopf now. You may proceed with your statement.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Mr. McHenry, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to provide a progress report on the Census Bureau's Integrated Communications Campaign. The campaign is a critical component of the census because it's aimed at boosting participation, especially among traditionally hard-to-count groups. Funding for the communications campaign received a substantial boost under the recently enacted American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Among other things, the Act provided up to $250 million in additional funding for outreach efforts to hard-to-count populations. This is a 61% increase over the $410 million the Bureau had originally budgeted for its communications effort. As requested, my remarks this morning focus on the status of the campaign's key components, including partnerships with governmental and other organizations, paid advertising and public relations, and Census in Schools, a program designed to reach parents and guardians through their school-aged children. In reviewing these components, this much is clear. If implemented as planned, the communications campaign will help position the Bureau to address the undercount. However, most of the activities we examined are in the planning or early implementation stages, and considerable work lies ahead. Future success will depend in part on how well the Bureau incorporates lessons learned and best practices from the 2000 census and takes other steps to enhance performance and accountability. Importantly, the communications campaign is focused on hard-to-count populations. As one example, Draft FCB, the contractor responsible for orchestrating the campaign, worked with the Bureau to segment the population into distinct clusters using data from the 2000 census that are correlated with a person's likelihood to respond. Each cluster was given a hard-to-count score, and the Bureau's communications efforts are to be targeted to those clusters with the highest scores. With respect to the campaign's specific components, the Bureau's partnership program is set to expand with additional funding under the Recovery Act. The Bureau had initially planned to hire 680 partnership staff for the 2010 census and achieved that level earlier this year. However, funding from the Recovery Act will enable the Bureau to hire around 2,000 additional partnership staff over the next few months. By comparison, the Bureau employed around 600 partnership staff for the 2000 census. Now, on the one hand, the higher staffing levels will enable the Bureau to better support local partnership efforts. On the other hand, it will be important for the Bureau to have the appropriate management infrastructure in place to hire, train, deploy, and supervise these additional personnel. Further, given the current state of the economy, the partners' ability to support the census is unclear. State and local governments, as well as community organizations, may not have the budget, staff, or time to aggressively promote the census. With respect to paid advertising, the Bureau plans to use numerous media sources, including digital media, to reach a diverse audience. Further, the Bureau has completed market research to gain an understanding of people's feelings about the census and the factors that inspire or hinder participation. The Census in Schools program is also moving forward under a contract with Scholastic Publishing. The Bureau plans to spend around $11 million on this effort in 2010, compared to $17 million in 2000. The Bureau believes the reduced funding levels will not significantly affect the program because it plans to leverage materials developed in 2000. It also plans to better target its efforts and make more of the materials available electronically through the Bureau's website rather than through printed copies. However, as with the partnership program, the extent to which schools have the resources to disseminate this material is unclear, and it will be important that the schools do not perceive the Bureau's approach as a financial burden. In summary, the Bureau's communications campaign appears to be comprehensive and integrated. Further, the Bureau appears to be addressing some of the factors that will be important for success, including incorporating lessons learned from 2000 and targeting resources to hard-to-count populations. Nevertheless, while the communications campaign has made some important steps forward, considerable work lies ahead in getting all of the key components fully operational. Further, while the funding from the Recovery Act could help expand the Bureau's outreach and promotion efforts, less clear is the extent to which these additional funds will improve response behavior or which component of the campaign will yield the best results. So therefore, in moving forward, it will be important for the Bureau to develop a spending plan for the additional funding it receives under the Recovery Act, identifying, among other things, cost estimates of the activities to be funded, the objectives and outcome-related goals of the planned spending, and how the spending will help achieve those goals. Chairman Clay and Mr. McHenry, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my remarks, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goldencock. Mr. Tarkasian, you're up for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McHenry, members of the subcommittee, draft FCB.
Would you move the microphone closer to you? Okay.
Draft FCB and our subcontractor partners, thank you for the opportunity today to talk to you about the Integrated Communications Campaign for the 2010 Census. Joining me today are colleagues from Draft FCB and our subcontractor partners Global Hue, DXposito, and Global Hue Latino. Since we spoke to you last on July 2nd, 2008, we remain on track to deliver the communications campaign to the marketplace in January 2010. Our work continues to be on budget, and we have made considerable progress. Let me give you a few highlights of that progress. First, the plan for the Integrated Communications Campaign was completed on July 15th and accepted by the Bureau in September of 2008. We began field work for the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators study called CBAMS in July and reported on its findings in the fall of 2008. This study has proven very, very effective to messaging development and to media planning, particularly in understanding the attitudes and behaviors of the hard-to-count. From a creative and messaging development standpoint, Draft FCB and our partners developed creative concepts during the November and December of last year for all audiences. We produced rough versions of approximately 114 concepts. We then traveled across the country gaining feedback in language and in culture from the audiences that will see these messages. In total, we spoke to approximately 1,400 people in 21 cities in the 48 contiguous states, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia, representing all races and ethnicities. In April, we'll be presenting a final report of the findings to the Bureau, and we plan to begin production of the advertising in June. From a media standpoint, Draft FCB and our partners developed media plans for all audiences earlier this year. Currently, we are issuing RFPs to media companies. We are also beginning to replan incorporating incremental dollars from the stimulus funding. These plans will be presented to the Bureau in April. While the timing of the upfront buy is very market-driven, we expect it to conclude at the latest in August 2009, which is the first phase of our buying, and a second buying phase for local media will occur in fall of 2009. With regard to the partnership program, we provide promotional items and materials to support it. We have developed materials and items, both ourselves and our partners, that have started arriving in regional offices in March and will continue through November. Materials consist of either action or awareness messaging. They will be available in 19 languages. All of them will be available electronically and many printed as well. With regards to public relations, we have been supporting the activity of the Bureau's PIO office with initiatives including weekly media monitoring, media training, the development of media lists, and logistics for the partner kickoff meeting later this month. For Census in Schools, the Bureau accepted the plan in January. We have begun implementation with the mailing of an announcement letter to principals. As far as the contract overall is concerned, we are on track to reach our very aggressive goal of 40% of the contract spending to small business. Most of these opportunities will occur in fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 10 in connection with the local and national media buys. In summary, at the risk of stating the obvious, the planning and implementation of the campaign is an enormous effort. We fully recognize its importance and urgency. There's only one chance to do this right. So we're grateful to the encouragement, input, and advice of stakeholders and Oversight. We are fully committed to making the campaign's decisions research and fact-based, as well as sensitive to the counsel of those whose insight and experience will help improve our efforts. So we proactively have incorporated as many opportunities in the campaign's development as possible to gain that insight. Today we look forward to your observations and advice, as well as any questions you may have about this extraordinary effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tarkazian. We will now go to our final witness, Ms. Cumberbatch. You have 5 minutes to make a presentation.
Good morning, Chairman Clay and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about the City of New York's plans to ensure a full and accurate count of our population. My name is Stacy Cumberbatch. I was appointed by Mayor Michael Bloomberg to serve as the City of New York Census 2010 coordinator. I have over 20 years of experience in public service, philanthropy, and the law. The City of New York is the most populous and ethnically diverse city in the United States, with a population of 8.36 million people as of July 2008. Over 3 million of New York City's residents are foreign-born, about 1/5 of whom arrived since 2000. New York City has the largest Chinese population of any city outside of Asia. More people of West Indian ancestry live in New York than any city outside of the West Indies. Over 2.27 million Hispanics live in New York City, more than any other city in the United States. Non-Hispanic New Yorkers of African descent numbered 1.95 million in 2006, more than double the count of any other city in the U.S. More than 200 languages are spoken, with almost 1/2 of all New Yorkers speaking a language other than English at home. New York City's diversity is its strength, but it also poses a challenge to ensuring that every New Yorker is counted in the 2010 census. Recognizing this, Mayor Bloomberg established the City Census Coordinator Office to act as a primary liaison with the Census Bureau, leverage city resources and relationships to promote the 2010 census, and supplement the outreach activities and communication strategies of the Regional Census Office. In a large and diverse city like New York, the partnership program is critical. However, there are many questions we have about the partnership program. How does the Census Bureau determine how many partnership specialists are assigned to New York City and how they are allocated across the city? How does the Bureau evaluate the work of individual partnership specialists as their outreach work proceeds, so that gaps and inefficiencies in their strategies are identified and fixed before the enumeration? What is the process to determine ethnic media buys in local markets, and how is the communication plan coordinated with the work of the partnership program? The Census Bureau needs to adopt a more formal process of convening diverse local stakeholders together, engaging them early in the development of a comprehensive local outreach and communication plan, so that local expertise and resources are included and considered. Again, I want to emphasize there must be an ongoing interactive feedback process as plans are implemented, so that local and Census Bureau resources can be deployed efficiently and problems can be fixed as they arise. While the city's population exceeded 8 million for the first time in 2000, the overall response rate to the mail-in questionnaire was 55%, much lower than the average national response rate of 66%. A further analysis conducted by the city's Department of Planning reveals that certain neighborhoods have a high concentration of low response rates tracks, below 40%. These same neighborhoods had low response rates in 1990 census, and in some areas, response rates actually got worse in 2000. One of our challenges over the next year is to penetrate these particular neighborhoods to reverse this historical low census response rate. These neighborhoods are largely African American and Afro-Caribbean. The New York City 2010 Census Office will make a concerted effort in collaboration with the Regional Census Office to work with a broad cross-section of leaders who can make the case in these communities of why it's important to be counted and participate in the census. The Census City Coordinator's Office is also working with over 20 city government agencies to develop plans to promote the 2010 census through existing agency communication networks and activities. For example, the New York City Housing Authority, which manages the city's public housing stock and Section 8 program, has assigned a staff person to my office to develop and implement outreach plans to reach 633,000 residents, 1 in 13 New Yorkers, who receive housing assistance from the Housing Authority. We have already held 2 briefing sessions with over 100 resident leaders explaining the 2010 census and providing them with information and data to focus their outreach efforts. This is an example of what is required to heighten public awareness, build trust, and encourage people to participate in the census by filling out the questionnaire. Public housing resident leaders got it right away about the importance. They were aghast to find out that certain developments had response rates as low as 31%. Now, what is key here is follow-through on everyone's part to continue to carry the message. In conclusion, while the census is a federal responsibility, there must be early and ongoing communication and accountability to local governments and communities, given the impact of the census on apportionment, districting, and federal funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we can get some of your questions answered today. We will start with Mr. Massenberg. Let me ask you about GAO has pointed out that a long-standing challenge facing the Census Bureau's marketing efforts is converting awareness of the census into an actual response. How do you plan to address this issue for 2010?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We see the integrated communication plan as our vehicle for converting hard-to-count populations into mail-back respondents. And it'll approach this problem on several fronts. First of all, both our advertising and our partnership program and our Census in Schools program all will focus on the hard-to-count population. So that's job one, to improve the mail response rate in the hard-to-count populations. The advertising will do that by providing the right message in the right language and the right media to those groups. But we understand that awareness and information is not enough. And that's why we're excited about the partnership program being expanded, thanks to the Recovery Act funding, to provide about 2,800 people that will be in the field providing logistical support, reaching out to a broader group of partnership, possible partners, and to provide the kind of follow-through that we sometimes lacked in 2000. So we see it as a very integrated program, get the message out, the information out through the advertising, follow through in the local areas, primarily through trusted voices in that community.
The level of effectiveness of partnerships as they proceed, so that gaps in their plans can be identified and addressed by local entities. Will there be a real partnership between the Bureau and local communities?
That certainly is the aim, Mr. Chairman. And we've got a couple of things in place that I think that are going to really assist on that. One is a tool we're calling our Integrated Partnership Contact Database. This is new. every time we partner with an organization, we will actually enter information on the organization, the characteristics of the group they represent, the number of members and affiliates that the group may have, whether they actually target a special ethnic audience, whether they're a business, an educational kind of facility, and such. That'll also lay out the kind of commitments that the organization has made in terms of supporting the census. That might encompass things as putting promotional materials. It may involve establishing a complete count committee. It will have specific actions in that we will then be tracking. But I think in terms of how effective we are, that's a responsibility of the regional directors and the regional staff, because after all, we think the census is really a local phenomenon. But it will be also closely monitored by our Field Division Office of Partnerships, and I can assure you it's going to be closely followed by the director, myself, and our associate directors for decennial and field operations. The real proof in the pudding is what will happen with mail response rates and differential undercount, and that's something that we will be focusing on once we start data collection. But until that point, we're really going to be tracking very carefully the number of complete count committees we have established. Last time we had 11,800. The goal for this census is to exceed that number. We have a goal of establishing 30,000 questionnaire assistance centers, and we have a goal of establishing 40,000 Be Counted, and we'll be tracking how we're doing on reaching those goals.
Thank you. Mr. Tarkasian, what new information was learned from the census barriers, attitudes, and motivators survey that did not previously exist?
The CBAM study was designed to give us a measure of what holds people back from responding and what are the things that we can use to motivate them to respond. We had, through the audience segmentation that the Bureau had done, where the hard-to-count populations live. We took that and we appended to it with a industry standard research source called Simmons, the media habits of the hard-to-count and the rest of the population. So what CBAMS gave us was sort of the missing bit of information, which is why people respond or why they don't respond and what's necessary to get them to respond. Some specific examples of how it helped us. We were able to segment the population into 5 mindsets. And we learned, for example, in one of those mindsets, which we call the head nodders, it's a group of people who are very, very impressionable to messages in the media. They may go into the census being predisposed to respond, but we know that their predisposition should change. So it's helped us because we're able to put more frequency against that particular target group in our media efforts than we might have if we hadn't had that bit of information. There are other groups where we've learned that privacy and security is not only a critical message, but that in conjunction with the work that we've done in copy testing has helped us to better craft that message so we understand precisely what the right thing is to say.
Okay.
So those are two examples.
Let me stop you right there. Now, you take a look at the map on the wall behind you. Did you find anything different in your study from what we have found in the map? You know, and this came from the Census Bureau, that data.
The map tells us where people reside. It tells us their location geographically, so therefore we can target our media and target our spending to them. It doesn't tell us why they do what they do. And the CBAM study is all about the why, so that we're able to then craft the media in terms of how we plan the media, what kinds of frequencies we use, what kinds of vehicles we may choose, as well as craft the message more precisely. That's really the value of this study.
And when you surveyed cities around the country, did you get any indication why suburban areas and urban areas vary so widely?
I'm not sure whether it's so much that it's somebody lives in the suburbs versus somebody lives in the city as the reason why it varies. It has to do with things related to people's lifestyle, people's family situations, as really the sort of first reasons why somebody might or might not respond. For example, one of the factors that's a critical factor is renting versus home ownership. Linguistic isolation versus being fluent in English is another critical factor.
Wait a minute now, renters versus homeowners, they both get mail. They both get the response form. So what's the difference?
Could you repeat your question? I'm sorry.
You said that one of the reasons were renters versus homeowners. I mean, if you're looking at suburban versus urban. So, I mean, both renters and homeowners receive mail on a daily basis, mostly. So what's the problem there?
One difference between renting and home ownership is that when you own a home, you make a longer-term, philosophically, commitment to being in that particular location. If you're a renter, you might only be making a 6-month commitment, a year-long commitment. You don't have the sense of ties to the community that you might, and therefore you may see responding to the census as being not quite so relevant and not quite so important to you versus being a homeowner.
And your study cost how much?
The study in total was a little over $1.4 million.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chaffetz, I recognize you for question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My understanding is that after the 2000 census, the GAO found that the Bureau had, in its report back, the GAO had found that the Bureau had no clear guidelines or criteria for selecting organizations in which it would partner for the census. And my question, Mr. Messenberg, in the absence of Mr. Olson, we're disappointed that he chose not to be here. In order to become a partner with the census, is there anything that would preclude somebody from being, is there any criteria by which they cannot become a partner with the census?
Okay, let me start with what our criteria are. So we're looking for organizations that possibly had in the past participated. They actually know what
I'm just interested in what would exclude somebody from being a partner.
Anything that would be an embarrassment to the census and prove ineffective to actually getting the hard to count to enumerate.
How do you define what an embarrassment is? Is that past behavior?
No, it'd probably be more in current behavior. I'm not quite clear what you're asking, Congressman. I mean, there are certainly certain organizations that we are not going to partner with.
But the question is, how do you determine which ones are and which ones aren't?
Well, as we look at the partnership program, we look at it about the same way as we look at the census, that it should be inclusive. So we start with the assumption that if an organization has good reach in the hard-to-count areas, then we'll be willing to partner with them.
But is there any criteria by which you would exclude somebody from partnering? If they had criminal backgrounds, if they had members that had... Is there no written criteria?
We have the written criteria that I was articulating. First, what's the reach into the hard-to-count areas? Do they have do they have respect? Will they be listened to in those organizations? Do they have the kind of organization that will permit them to be viewed as a trusted voice? So I think the trust of the organization in the local community will be a key criteria.
Well, I guess that's the question, is how do we define who's trustworthy who would be, and to use your words, an embarrassment, where is that line is what I'm trying to get at.
We don't have a hard line. I'd say where we start with the proposition that we should be inclusive. And if an organization demonstrates that they are not going to be a strong supporter to the census, then that would give us pause for continuing the partnership. At this point, of course, we're very early in forging these partnerships. And what most organizations do, they may agree to do proclamations, provide on-site recruiting and training sites and those sorts of things.
You can understand and appreciate there are some organizations out there that would draw criticism from some and praise from others. So there is no hard line. Based on the 2000 census and the recommendation from the GAO, given all those years, there's actually no written guideline that say we would exclude these people. I mean, if they were involved in corruption, voter fraud, anything like that, would that not exclude somebody from participating?
That would give us pause for consideration whether we should partner if there was proof that they had done that sort of behavior.
As an individual or as an organization or both?
Well, typically always we're partnering with the organization, not with a specific individual within the organization.
Okay, so you would look at the actions of the individuals within that organization to help make that determination as to whether or not they had a pattern of misbehavior?
We would not have the capability of doing that. In Census 2000, we partner with over 140,000 organizations. It is just not practical or feasible to track every individual's performance within that, or should that be the business of the Census Bureau, I believe. If the organization has the respect of people in the local community and can help us count the hard-to-count people, then we would partner with them.
And if they don't have the respect, then by the same criteria you would say we would exclude them from partnering.
Yes. Okay. We're looking for partners to be trusted voices within the local community.
What about political organizations? Is that an acceptable, if that group is a political organization, would that be an acceptable criteria by which they could participate as a partner?
We partnered in Census 2000. We formed 11,800 complete count committees. Those committees were formed by the highest elected official in the town, the city, the state. So in that sense, we certainly have a long record of partnering with political organizations, state and local governments, tribal government.
How many census workers will partners be supplying to the Bureau overall, would you guess?
The partners will not be providing any persons to work on the census. They will be providing their expertise, their resources to help us promote our message. They will not be involved in census taking or census activities directly at all.
What are the specific penalties for an enumerator committing fraud?
5 years imprisonment and or $250,000 fine.
Based on the last census, how many people actually were convicted of such a penalty?
I don't have that figure on the top of my head, but I can get it for you, Congressman.
And what is the legal authority, or who has jurisdiction to actually go back and pursue somebody that you may believe as an enumerator may be fraudulent? Is it the FBI? Who pursues those?
That would be the U.S. Attorney's Office.
U.S. Attorney's Office, okay. And what mechanism do you have in place to actually, once they reach that threshold, to actually engage the U.S. Attorney's Office?
We have detailed quality assurance steps in place that, for example, during the non-response follow-up operation, we'll do a re-interview process, and that would permit us to identify systematic fraud being conducted by an enumerator, and that would be that would engender legal action being taken against them.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for allowing me to go over my time. Let me just say in conclusion that it's very disappointing to know that there is no written guideline as to who would qualify and not qualify. I know what you're looking for. You want to get as many bodies and many organizations involved as possible. But I find it totally unacceptable and scary, quite frankly, that we don't have criteria by which we can all agree that partners would either meet a certain threshold or not meet a certain threshold. I would hope that at your earliest convenience, you would get back to this committee, and me specifically, with details as to who qualifies and who doesn't. Because there are some organizations on that list that, quite frankly, many of us are very concerned about. While certain segments of the population may think there's no problem, I happen to be one that think there is a problem. And I'm very disappointed that, given the GAO report that came after 2000, that there was no follow-up and there is no written guideline, and I think we should all be very concerned about it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome for that. Thank you. Ms. Watson, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. According to the March 20th Washington Post article, the current economic crisis may threaten the 2010 census efforts to get a full and accurate count. The increase in home foreclosures and the rising jobless rate means that Americans are indeed leaving their homes. All the while, increased financial hardships may make some Americans less willing to cooperate with census workers. Now, and this is for anyone on the panel that might want to respond, are there any specific plans in the integrated communication campaign which reflects this new reality? And do you foresee the economic crisis adding to the undercount rate of hard-to-count populations? And let me just say, I'm looking up here at some handouts, and you probably have a copy of them, and I'm really troubled because the areas that are, we get the less response and the undercount are the areas that have been hit hardest by foreclosures. So anyone on the panel, and let's just go down the line.
All right. Let me start. Let me just reiterate that our entire communication strategy is focusing on the hard-to-count populations, and these maps are actually reflect the data that we're using in terms of where to devote resources, both from an advertising perspective, but also from our local partnership program. As we And I think we need, well, let me start again. The partnership program is really our voice into the local community. And we're looking at the hard-to-count areas, and that's where we're going to be placing additional partnership staff. What we need are folks in the local community to tell us and inform us on what some of the special problems that we may be encountering, whether they're tent cities or increasing foreclosure rates. That will help us shape the message, and it'll also help us form questionnaire assistance centers in those areas so we can reach out to that group and assist them on, first, reassuring them that it's safe and confidential to fill out the data, and second, we provide a location they can come to actually fill that out.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Well, I would echo some of that. The partnership program is key to getting down at the grassroots level, convincing people that it's okay to respond to the census, overcoming any of their barriers that they have, their fears that they have to respond to the census, whether it's concerns about confidentiality or privacy or how the information will be used. The questionnaire assistance centers, Be Counted campaign will also be part of that as well. And it's what the Census Bureau has, and this is a good thing, it's a series of backstopping operations where if the Census Bureau misses you in one operation, they'll try and get you in another operation, and they have several of these safety nets. But I do want to point out, though, with the Census Bureau's use of numbers here, I think they use 30,000 questionnaire assistance centers and 40,000 Be Counted locations. Now, all of those questionnaire assistance centers will be be counted locations. So the total is not 70,000. It's actually there will be 30,000 questionnaire assistance centers and 10,000 additional be counted locations. So that number is not as big as was made by the Census Bureau.
Let me just expand my inquiry here. In California, we have one particular town that's a ghost town, almost completely in foreclosure. How you send something to that address, people are no longer there. How are we going to track to be able to find where this population has disappeared to so they can be counted? They're no longer in that town.
So one response, if that community would have participated in our local update of census addresses that was done about a year ago, then we may have some intelligence about that, and those changes would have been reflected in our census mail list. If they haven't been, then when we go out to the field, or hopefully before we go out to the field, in conversations with those local communities, people will tell us and inform us that this is a real problem issue. And then we can take appropriate action. As my colleague from GAO was mentioning, we have various ways that we can enumerate. One is mailing a census form out and hoping it comes back. Another is actually to send an enumerator to an address and try to collect that data right away.
They're no longer in Dodge.
Yep. If they're no longer there, it would be useful for us to know that at the beginning of the census process, because our normal procedure would be, would be to mail out a census report form. Then we wouldn't get any response back. We'd send another replacement form possibly out there, and then eventually at the beginning of May we would send an enumerator. And we will visit 6 times to make sure that no one's actually there. So the sooner that we could identify that was a problem, the better off we would be.
My time is almost up, but let me just say this. I hope that if you prepare standards, you base it on now and not in the past, because we do want criminals who are back in the population counted. Mm-hmm. We want every individual. They exist somewhere, and this means resources to the community where they exist. So I don't think criminal records have anything to do with it, and you need to, I always suggest, and I call in the regional director where I'm located in Los Angeles to talk about how they can count people. And we want people, maybe like kind, to go in, and with particularly some of our ethnic communities. If somebody comes in looking like a process server, believe me, the population disappears. But if they come in looking like a member of the community, they're more trusted. We have this problem with apartments because they'll put 2 people down when there really are 12 people residing in there, hiding out. So I do hope that you will take into consideration what we need now, the undercount, and how we solve that problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the extra time.
Thank you, Ms. Watson, for those pointed questions. I appreciate it. And now, Mr. McHenry, you recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you for your leadership. Mr. Metzenborg, the original notice from the committee was a request to testify by Mr. Tony Farthing, New York Regional Director of the Census Bureau, and Mr. Tim Olson, Assistant Division Chief of Partnership for the Field Division of the Census Bureau, the subject matter of this hearing today. However, as we all can see, they're not seated next to you. There are 2 empty chairs. Are they present here today?
No, they're not, Congressman.
Okay. I think it's disrespectful for the committee for you to simply say no, that they cannot testify. Can you tell me why they're not testifying today? Did it not meet with their schedule?
Well, actually, it's been our past practice that either typically that the director or the acting director will testify. Where we needed the expertise, we certainly have had associate directors testify. I think it's been rare indeed where we've had grade 15 office chiefs testify. I believe that I have to be knowledgeable about what's going on in the organization, and I feel comfortable about our partnership program, where we are and where we need to be. The other thing that we have been doing is we've been doing a series of briefings on the Hill. We've been bringing in our regional directors, and we've been bringing in the appropriate staff for those staff briefings.
Well, I'd certainly want a full briefing, and I do think it's important. I mean, based on this precedent, so the director, the acting director, is the representative of the Bureau around the city and before Congress?
That the acting director, I'm sorry, Congressman, I believe, yes, I am representing the Census Bureau.
But that's your tradition, is that you
Yes.
represent the Bureau around it. It's interesting because I just read a story about a forum at Brookings, and you had a division head represent the Bureau there.
That's right. Frank Vetrano represented the Bureau. Up until about a week ago, we had no presence at that forum. So we called the organizers and asked to send someone. Actually, they asked for Frank to sit on the panel that discussed the census.
So it's okay for division heads to speak around town, but they can't come before Congress.
Well, I wouldn't agree to.
It just seems ridiculous to me, is what I'm saying. We've got an individual who's going to be spending hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars that we actually want technical answers for, to make sure that we minimize the undercount, and they can't testify. So I'm going to have some specific questions. You'll probably end up having to talk to Mr. Olson and have written answers for it, and I understand.
Okay.
And it's not to say that you're running a big organization. It's a multi-billion-dollar organization. Therefore, we're just trying to get the division knowledge and make sure that we have a strong baseline of understanding of where we can help. That's what it's all about. Okay. It's you know, certainly. Now, was that decision made by you to not allow them to testify?
It was made by the Department of Commerce.
The Department of Commerce. Mm-hmm. Who is the head of the Department of Commerce currently? Who made that decision?
The senior advisor to the secretary, along with the communication staff down.
Well, there is no secretary. There's an acting secretary.
No, I'm saying the staff, the senior staff assistant to the secretary-to-be.
Well, the secretary-to-be wasn't sworn in when this decision was made. The answer was no last week, and there was no Commerce secretary. He was testifying before a committee in the Senate last week.
The senior political official at the Commerce Department made the decision. I didn't mean to say that Secretary-designate Locke made the decision.
All right. Well, so no White House. There was no White House involvement in this?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, let's actually get to some substance here. Frank Vetrano, before Brookings last week, said that statistical sampling, quote, is not in our current plans, end quote. Is that?
That's true.
That is true. Now, is that, can you elaborate on that? It's not the current plans. Are there potential plans for sampling?
Statistical adjustment has not been in our planning all during the decade as we prepared for the 2010 census.
Okay. Does the way he words his answer, it's not in our current plans. I mean, wouldn't you just say it's not in our plans?
It's not in our plans, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, to go to some other elements here, Mr. Goldenkopf, certainly appreciate your report on the communications efforts. It's certainly helpful to get some outside assessment of the effectiveness and some historical reference here. In Figure 1 of your report, you talk about the undercounts and overcounts between 1990 and the 2000 census.
Just bear with me for one second. I have Okay.
And Figure 1, there are a number of different metrics of race and ethnicity of undercounts or overcounts. And in Figure 1, there is a section, American Indian / Alaska Native on reservations. There was a 12.22% undercount in 1990 and a 0.88% overcounts in 2000. Can you speak to that? Why there was such an enormous shift, and what was done to create that massive change?
The switch. The Bureau recognized that following the 1990